The screech of tires echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac as a sleek silver Mercedes came to an abrupt halt in front of the modest suburban home. Out stepped Karen Hollister, a middle-aged woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, oversized designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and a tailored blouse that screamed suburban queen. Her lips were painted a bold red, curled into a smug smirk, as she adjusted her posture to exude authority. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the neighbor everyone whispered about. The one who called the HOA, Homeowners Association, if your mailbox leaned slightly to the left, or sent passive-aggressive notes about excessive noise when kids played basketball in their driveways. She thrived on control, micromanaging every aspect of the neighborhood to fit her vision of perfection. And today, she had a new target. 14-year-old Miguel Rodriguez. Miguel was a shy but resourceful Latino boy, with dark brown eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. He lived with his single mother, Rosa, who worked long hours as a nurse to make ends meet. Their small house wasn't as polished as the others on the street. Chipped paint here, a slightly overgrown lawn there, but it was filled with warmth and love. That didn't matter to Karen. To her, Miguel's family represented everything wrong with the neighborhood. Messy, disrespectful, and worst of all, not up to standards. It started with a complaint about Miguel's bike being left outside overnight. Then came a note about the recycling bins not being sorted properly. But this morning, Karen had crossed a line. She marched up to Rosa at the mailbox, her voice dripping with condescension. "You really should teach your son some manners," Karen snapped, gesturing dramatically toward Miguel, who stood nearby tinkering with an old laptop on the porch. "He's been sneaking into my backyard again. If I catch him one more time, I'm calling the police." Rosa stiffened, clutching the mail tightly in her hands. "Miguel wouldn't do that," she replied firmly, though exhaustion tinged her voice. "If there's an issue, we can talk about it like adults." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes behind her sunglasses. "Oh, please, spare me the excuses. You people never take responsibility." The comment hung in the air like poison, sharp and suffocating. Miguel froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard of his laptop. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the screen in front of him. Little did Karen know, Miguel wasn't just any kid. Beneath his quiet demeanor lay a brilliant mind, a self-taught coding prodigy who could hack into almost anything. What started as a hobby to pass the time had evolved into a skill set most adults would envy. And while Miguel usually preferred to stay out of trouble, Karen's relentless bullying had awakened something inside him. That night, as rain pattered gently against the windows, Miguel sat hunched over his laptop in the dim glow of his desk lamp. His dark eyes darted across lines of code, his fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced precision. On the screen was a live feed from Karen's Ring camera, a device she proudly used to monitor everyone else's business. "Let's see how much you love being watched," Miguel muttered under his breath, a sly grin spreading across his face. What Karen didn't realize was that her latest act of cruelty had set off a chain reaction, one that would expose her secrets, challenge her power, and force her to confront the consequences of her actions. But Miguel wasn't doing this for revenge. Not entirely. This was about sending a message. Even the most untouchable people have vulnerabilities. And sometimes, the quietest voices are the ones you should fear the most. The next morning, Karen strutted out of her house with her usual air of superiority, clutching a Starbucks cup and scrolling through her phone. She paused briefly to glare at Miguel's house across the street, as if daring them to step out of line again. What she didn't notice was the small black device taped discreetly under her porch railing, a Wi-Fi signal booster Miguel had planted during one of his sneaking expeditions. Inside her home, Karen went about her routine, oblivious to the digital storm brewing around her. Her smart devices, the Ring cameras, the Alexa speaker, the Nest thermostat, all hummed along smoothly, feeding data directly into Miguel's laptop. He wasn't just watching her. He was learning her patterns, uncovering her secrets, and mapping out every corner of her meticulously curated life. By midday, Miguel had discovered more than he bargained for. Hidden folders on Karen's personal cloud storage revealed a trove of incriminating evidence. Photos of her illegally dumping trash in a community park, emails threatening neighbors who dared to challenge her authority, and even recordings of private HOA meetings where she manipulated votes to suit her agenda. But the most shocking discovery came when Miguel stumbled upon a series of transactions labeled consulting fees. At first glance, they seemed innocuous, until he traced them back to a shell company linked to a local developer, accused of unethical land grabs. It appeared Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was actively profiting from pushing families like Miguel's out of their homes. Miguel leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. This was bigger than he thought. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he in over his head? Could exposing Karen put his family at risk? But then he remembered the way she'd spoken to his mother, the dismissive tone, the thinly veiled insults, the sheer entitlement. No, he couldn't back down now. That evening, Miguel devised a plan. Using his skills, he hacked into Karen's social media accounts, planting breadcrumbs that would lead curious neighbors to question her integrity. He uploaded screenshots of her shady dealings to an anonymous blog, tagging influential members of the community. And finally, he sent an encrypted email to a local investigative journalist known for taking on corruption cases. Within hours, the neighborhood WhatsApp group lit up with chatter. "Did you see this?" one neighbor typed, sharing a link to the blog post. "Apparently Karen's been working with that developer trying to buy us all out." "I knew something was off about her," another replied. "Remember how she forced the Garcias to sell last year?" Karen, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. She spent the afternoon hosting a garden party for her closest allies, laughing loudly and boasting about her latest HOA victory. It wasn't until late that night, when her phone began buzzing incessantly, that she realized something was wrong. "What is this nonsense?" Karen muttered, scrolling through notifications. Her Instagram comments were flooded with accusations, her Facebook posts bombarded with angry messages. Even her carefully curated LinkedIn profile had been flagged for suspicious activity. Panic set in as she opened the anonymous blog post. Each revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. By the time she reached the part about the illegal payments, her hands were trembling so violently she nearly dropped her phone. "This can't be happening," she whispered, pacing frantically around her kitchen. "Who did this? Who would dare?" Her gaze drifted toward Miguel's house, suspicion flickering in her eyes. But before she could act, her doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent sound that made her jump. When she opened the door, she found a man in a suit holding a clipboard. "Ms. Hollister?" he asked politely. "We're here regarding some allegations filed against you. May we come in?" Karen's face went pale. Across the street, Miguel watched silently from his bedroom window, a faint smile playing on his lips. The investigators stayed for hours, their presence casting a shadow over Karen's pristine home. As they combed through documents, laptops, and even her phone, Karen paced nervously, her usual confidence crumbling under the weight of their questions. "This is ridiculous," she snapped at one point, her voice shrill and defensive. "Someone set me up. I'm being targeted because I care about this neighborhood." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence was undeniable. Emails, financial records, and even surveillance footage Miguel had extracted from her own security system painted a damning picture. By the time the investigators left, carrying boxes of confiscated materials, Karen looked like a woman who'd been stripped of everything she held dear. Her designer blouse was wrinkled, her makeup smeared from wiping away tears, and her once immaculate hair now hung limply around her face. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. By morning, Karen's downfall was the talk of every driveway and coffee shop. Neighbors who had once feared or tolerated her now openly mocked her misfortune. "Good riddance," muttered Mr. Petal, the elderly man whose garden parties Karen had repeatedly shut down for noise violations. "I always knew she was trouble," added Mrs. Thompson, clutching her dog tightly. "It's karma catching up with her." For Miguel, however, the victory felt bittersweet. Sitting alone in his room, he scrolled through the comments online, watching as strangers dissected Karen's life. He hadn't intended to humiliate her, at least not entirely. His goal had been justice, a way to protect his family and others like them from her manipulative tactics. But seeing the vitriol directed at her made him uneasy. His mother noticed the change in him almost immediately. That evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table eating leftovers, Rosa placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mijo, what's wrong?" she asked softly. "You've seemed distant since yesterday." Miguel hesitated, debating how much to tell her. Finally, he sighed and pushed his plate aside. "I did something, Mama," he admitted quietly. "Something big." Rosa raised an eyebrow, concern flickering in her warm brown eyes. "What do you mean?" So Miguel told her everything: the hacking, the blog post, the journalist. As he spoke, he braced himself for disappointment or anger. But when he finished, Rosa simply nodded thoughtfully. "You were trying to protect us," she said after a moment, her tone measured but kind, "and I understand why you did it. But mijo, revenge isn't always the answer. Sometimes doing the right thing means letting people face their own consequences without dragging yourself into the mud." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For all his brilliance, Miguel realized he still had much to learn about morality and responsibility. Meanwhile, Karen's world continued to unravel. Stripped of her position in the HOA and facing potential legal charges, she became a pariah in the community she had once ruled with an iron fist. Her Mercedes sat untouched in the driveway, its shine dulled by neglect. She stopped attending neighborhood events, retreating further into isolation. One rainy afternoon, weeks after the scandal broke, Miguel spotted her sitting alone on her porch, staring blankly at the street. Gone was the haughty woman who had terrorized the neighborhood. In her place was someone broken, defeated. Against his better judgment, Miguel grabbed an umbrella and crossed the street. When Karen saw him approaching, her expression hardened, though there was no mistaking the flicker of fear in her eyes. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. Miguel hesitated, then held out a small envelope. Inside was a USB drive containing copies of the evidence he'd gathered, not just against her, but also implicating the developer she'd worked with. "If you cooperate with the investigation," he said evenly, meeting her gaze, "you might have a chance to fix some of the damage you've caused. If not..." He let the sentence hang, leaving her to fill in the blanks. Karen stared at the envelope, her hands shaking as she took it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Why are you doing this?" "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Miguel replied. "Even you." As he walked back home, the rain began to ease, giving way to faint streaks of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The days that followed were a blur of whispered conversations and cautious glances as the neighborhood adjusted to the seismic shift in its dynamics. Karen's fall from grace had left a void, one that no one seemed eager to fill. The HOA meetings, once dominated by her ironclad rules and sharp tongue, now felt strangely subdued. Neighbors who had previously kept their heads down began speaking up, proposing changes that prioritized community over control. For Miguel, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, or at least what passed for it after such an extraordinary ordeal. He spent his afternoons tinkering with his laptop, or helping his mother around the house, avoiding the curious stares of neighbors who occasionally stopped by to thank him. Word had spread about his role in exposing Karen, though no one could prove it. Still, the admiration and occasional suspicion was palpable. But despite the newfound respect, Miguel couldn't shake the weight of what he'd done. Every time he saw Karen sitting alone on her porch, her shoulders slumped in defeat, guilt gnawed at him. He had wanted justice, not destruction. Yet here she was, a shadow of her former self, ostracized by the very community she had tried so hard to dominate. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Miguel found himself standing outside Karen's house once more. This time, he didn't bring an envelope or a plan, just a question burning in his mind. Karen looked up as he approached, her expression guarded but less hostile than before. She didn't say anything, simply waited for him to speak. "I just wanted to ask you something," Miguel began, his voice hesitant. "Do you regret any of it? The way you treated people, I mean." Karen stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse to answer. Then, with a heavy sigh, she leaned back in her chair and looked away. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she admitted quietly, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Keeping things orderly, protecting property values, making sure everyone followed the rules." She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "But I guess maybe I lost sight of what really mattered, or who." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Miguel hadn't expected an apology, not from someone like Karen, but hearing her acknowledge her mistakes, however reluctantly, softened something inside him. "You can still make things right," he said softly. "It's not too late." Karen gave him a skeptical look, one eyebrow raised. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that? Everyone hates me now." "They don't hate you," Miguel corrected gently. "They're hurt. There's a difference. If you show them you've changed, if you actually try to help instead of control, they'll notice. She didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher whether he was being sincere or mocking her. Finally, she nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Maybe," she murmured, more to herself than to him. As Miguel walked away, he felt a strange sense of closure. He hadn't forgiven Karen, not entirely, but he understood her now. Beneath the bravado and cruelty was a woman who had been as trapped by her own choices as those she sought to control. Months later, the neighborhood bore little resemblance to its former self, thanks in part to Karen's quiet efforts to rebuild trust. She started small, volunteering at the local food bank, organizing a cleanup day at the park, even offering free gardening tips to anyone willing to listen. It wasn't perfect. Some neighbors still avoided her like the plague, but progress was undeniable. Miguel watched it all unfold from afar, content to let others take the lead this time. His focus had shifted inward, toward using his skills for good rather than revenge. Inspired by the journalist he'd contacted during Karen's downfall, he began reaching out to organizations fighting digital inequality, teaching coding workshops for underprivileged kids in nearby communities. His mother beamed with pride whenever she saw him mentoring a group of wide-eyed students, their faces lighting up as they grasped a new concept. "You've always had a gift, mijo," Rosa told him one evening, placing a plate of empanadas on the table. "Now you're sharing it with the world." Miguel smiled, though his thoughts drifted briefly to Karen. He wondered if she ever thought about the boy who had turned her life upside down, or if she realized that in some ways they weren't so different. Both had used their talents to challenge systems, to fight for what they believed was right. The difference lay in how they chose to wield that power. One crisp autumn afternoon, as leaves swirled lazily in the wind, Miguel received an unexpected visitor. Standing on his doorstep was Karen, holding a small potted plant wrapped in burlap. "I know we got off on the wrong foot," she said awkwardly, thrusting the plant toward him. "This is, well, it's peace lily. Symbolic, I guess. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance to fix things." Miguel accepted the plant with a nod, surprised but touched by the gesture. "You're welcome," he replied simply. As Karen turned to leave, he called after her, "Hey, Karen." She glanced over her shoulder, eyebrows raised. "You're doing good work," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Keep it up." For the first time in months, Karen smiled back, a genuine, unguarded smile that hinted at redemption. And as Miguel closed the door, cradling the peace lily in his arms, he knew the neighborhood would never be the same again.